Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The late afternoon sun sat high and unrelenting over the Arizona territory. The land was pale with dust, dotted by mesquite and the scattered remains of wagon crates split open along a wash. A man rode along the track with his head slightly bent, his hat brim shading his face. His name was Elias Harper, a cowboy hardened by years of cattle drives and the kind of work no one else wanted. He carried no illusions about himself. People remembered him for violence in his past, though most of those stories were half-truths passed around saloons. What he remembered was losing his wife and son years back to fever, buried alone on ground that never felt like home again. Since then, he had chosen the life of a drifter who stayed only where silence allowed him to breathe. He slowed his gelding when he saw a shape leaning against a wooden post half buried in sand. A woman sat there, her knees pulled tight, her eyes cast down. Her dark braids were tied with worn leather strips, her dress rough at the seams, her face marked with dust and one healing scrape along the cheek. She did not look at him, and she did not ask. Her stillness was deliberate, like someone who had already learned how little asking ever brought. Elias's throat tightened. He had seen women abandoned before, widows left after raids, daughters traded away in debts, or wives walked out on when the cattle market failed. This one carried the kind of weight that didn't come from just hunger. He stopped his horse, slid down, and unhooked his canteen. He did not speak when he set it on the ground close to her hand. She glanced once, hesitant, then lifted it and drank in slow, controlled swallows. Not desperate, but guarded, as if even water might be taken away at any moment. When she lowered the canteen, her eyes flicked toward him at last. They held no plea, no trust, only the cold measure of someone deciding whether another human being was danger or reprieve. "My name is Elias," he said, his voice steady but low. He had learned to speak plainly, without weight. The woman nodded once, her lips dry, and replied in a voice that was steady despite exhaustion. "Taya." Nothing else. Inside, Elias felt the edge of unease. He did not want responsibility. Every time he had let someone stay close, the cost had been loss. But leaving her here meant watching her fade into the dust, and he could not carry another ghost. His jaw set as he weighed what little food he had, what space his cabin offered, and the looks he would get if he brought her into town later. The choice pressed down heavy, but it was a choice all the same. Taya's heart beat hard against her ribs as she studied him. The settlers had left her behind after rumors that she was too big to bear children. To them, that made her a burden. To her own people, she was no longer wanted either, marked by rejection on both sides. She had braced herself for scorn or worse from the man standing above her. Yet he gave no look of pity, no leer, only the simple act of setting water at her side. It was enough to stir something she had not felt in weeks, a faint sense that she was being seen, not judged. Elias looked at the long stretch of road behind her, empty and useless. He looked at the gelding, patient and worn, at the cracked skin on her hands that spoke of hard work done without complaint. He weighed his options a final time. The world had already written her off, but he had lived long enough to know that sometimes staying alive was reason enough. "Come on," he said, motioning toward his horse and the faint trail that led westward. "Cabin's not far." Taya hesitated, her chest tight with both fear and a strange pull of relief. She knew following him meant stepping into another kind of unknown, but the road behind her was nothing but hunger and silence. She rose slowly, legs stiff from waiting too long under the sun, and walked toward the horse. Elias did not reach to help. He only steadied the reins and gave her space. When she settled behind him, careful and rigid, he nudged the gelding forward. The trail stretched ahead, dust lifting under hooves, the land swallowing the day. Neither spoke again, but both felt the weight of a beginning neither had chosen yet could not turn away from. The gelding carried them across the flat ground until the sky began to dim and the heat broke enough for breath to feel less heavy. Elias said little, and Taya sat stiff behind him, her hands resting lightly at his belt but never clinging, as if touching too much might risk anger. His cabin came into view at the edge of a dry arroyo, a plain structure built from pine boards hauled years ago from a logging camp. Its roof patched with tar paper and a stone chimney leaning but solid. It was not much, yet it stood, and for Elias that was enough. He slowed the horse, swung down, and gave her a steady hand to dismount. She hesitated, then accepted. Her legs shook from too many hours without rest. Elias untied the small sack of beans and the half-empty flour sack from the saddle, his mind running through what little he had left. He did not live with plenty, but he had survived on less, and now there would be two. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and iron. A single bed was pushed against the wall. A rough-hewn table stood at the center with two chairs, and the shelves held only a few dishes, a tin cup, and a pot. Elias saw the way Taya's eyes moved over everything, cautious but not surprised. She had expected less, maybe nothing at all. He set his hat on a peg, then motioned for her to sit. She lowered herself onto the chair as if it might be pulled away at any moment. Elias lit a small lamp, poured a cup of water, and slid it across. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached for it, and he noticed how raw her palms were, cracked from sun and work. He remembered the whispers from town, women spoken of as burdens if they could not bear children, and he understood now what had been done to her. While beans simmered in the pot, he studied her quietly. She wore a dress that had been mended more than once, with seams that barely held. Her shoulders were strong, her frame taller and broader than most women, but her eyes, when she finally let them rise, showed more than rejection. They showed a tired fight to exist where no one wanted her. Elias felt the old weight of decision again. He had promised himself years ago not to take on what he could not protect. Yet here she was, eating quietly at his table, the first person in months to share the silence of this cabin. Taya kept her eyes on the food, chewing slow and deliberate. Inside, her mind circled the same questions. Why had this man not asked anything of her? Not pressed her with the words others always used, work, debt, or worse. She listened for tones of demand and found none. The chair he slid toward her had not scraped, as though he had thought even that sound might unsettle her. When she glanced at him, she caught a stillness in his face that was not cruel, only tired. As night drew close, Elias placed a folded blanket at the foot of the bed. "You take the bed," he said, voice steady. "I'll sleep by the fire." Taya's chest tightened. No man had offered her rest without cost before. She wanted to ask why, but her throat refused. She only nodded once, holding the blanket close. Elias settled onto the floor with his coat for a pillow. He did not sleep immediately. His mind traced back to the grave mounds he had left behind years ago, to the woman and child he had lost, and to the violence that had carved him into a man who trusted silence more than words. Looking at Taya, he knew the questions she carried were the same as his. What next? Why stay alive? How to keep standing when the world wanted you gone? The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the roof, and for the first time in years the cabin held more than one kind of breathing. Neither spoke, but both understood that by morning, the choice to share this space would bind them in ways no words had yet dared to touch. Morning came sharp and cold despite the desert's endless sun. The thin walls of the cabin did little to hold warmth, and the smoke from the fire lingered low before sliding out through the chimney. Elias stirred first. Years of trail life had taught him to wake before dawn, his body set to work before thought caught up. He sat on the edge of the floor blanket, watching Taya as she lay still in the bed. She was not asleep. Her breathing was too shallow, too careful. He knew she had spent the night waiting for the sound of a step too close. He let her be, stood, and set coffee to boil with the same measured motions he had used for years. When the first clink of the tin cup touched the table, Taya finally moved. She sat up slowly, clutching the folded blanket, her eyes scanning the room as if making certain everything was still in place. Elias caught that look and recognized it. He had seen it in himself after the war, the need to check whether the world had shifted while he slept. "You can stay here," he said quietly, not looking at her when he spoke. "Don't owe me anything." Her eyes narrowed, searching for the hidden cost. There had always been one before. Work until her hands bled, submit to words she didn't want to hear, or worse. She measured him in silence, waiting for the real price. But all he did was set bread on the table, split from the last loaf, and motion for her to sit. She did, still wary but drawn by hunger too strong to ignore. Over the meal, Elias explained what he had not said the night before. I work cattle when the drives come through. Fix fences for neighbors. Sometimes ride to town for supplies. He kept his tone even plain, like listing tools in a box. Cabin's mine. Built it myself. No one else lives here. The words answered the unspoken questions in her eyes. Whose house this was, whether another woman might return to claim it, whether she was only passing through someone else's life. His bluntness made her shoulders ease a little, though she did not let it show fully. Taya lowered her gaze to her hands, the cracked skin stinging as she flexed her fingers. I can cook, she said, voice flat but certain. I can wash. I can work soil. It was not an offer made out of willingness alone, but out of fear, the need to prove she had value before she was cast out again. Elias studied her for a long moment. He had heard the same tone from men on the trail who had lost everything, men desperate to trade skill for a chance to remain part of something. He could have told her she did not need to prove herself, but he understood that words like that would sound empty. Instead, he nodded. Then we'll both eat better. That answer steadied her more than comfort ever could. She did not trust promises, but she could accept a plain agreement. The rest of the day unfolded with cautious rhythm. Elias repaired a fence rail that the last windstorm had loosened, the sharp crack of his hammer striking nails echoing through the arroyo. Taya carried water from the well, her arms straining but steady. She rinsed beans, set them in the pot, and swept the cabin floor with a branch broom Elias had fashioned seasons ago. Each task was simple, but in them she found a kind of anchor. No one pulled the work from her hands. No one told her it was not enough. Later, when the sun dropped lower and heat gave way to the chill of evening, Elias returned from the corral. He found the table set, 2 tin plates, 2 cups, the beans simmering with what salt remained. Taya sat at the table, her posture straight, her eyes avoiding his, but the effort she had taken to arrange things was clear. He sat across from her, the scrape of his chair measured and quiet. They ate without words for a long time. Elias did not mind. Silence had always been his truest companion. But he knew people beyond these walls would not leave them be forever. The town had sharp eyes, sharper tongues, and the woman sitting across from him carried the kind of mark that drew them out. He did not speak of it yet. She had only just begun to breathe without flinching. Taya, for her part, wondered what this man truly wanted. He had not pressed her, had not asked about the shame others threw at her, the whispers that she was too big, too unfit, not worth a family. The question hung in her chest like a stone. When would he bring it up? She forced herself to keep eating, but her mind would not rest. When the meal ended, Elias set a bucket of water near her side without comment. She met his eyes then, just briefly, and for the first time there was no suspicion in hers. Only the smallest trace of gratitude that she did not voice. As the night closed in, the cabin held them both in its narrow frame. A man with ghosts of his own, and a woman cast out for reasons neither fair nor kind. For now, they had given each other what the world would not, a place to stay and silence that did not wound. The fourth morning broke with a dull sky and a restless wind that rattled the boards of the cabin. Elias knew supplies were running thin. The flour sack was light, the coffee nearly gone, and the beans would not stretch far. Living alone, he could make it last week's, but with 2 mouths, the rhythm had changed. He had expected that, though. A trip to town was no longer something he could put off. When he told Taya they would ride in, she hesitated. Her shoulders stiffened, and her hands folded against each other on the table. She remembered, too, well, how people's eyes cut deeper than knives. Elias saw the tension, and for the first time since she had entered his cabin, he explained himself more clearly. We need flour, beans, salt, coffee. Can't trade for it out here. You'll come along. See for yourself what's what. He did not soften his voice, but he made sure it carried no command. Taya gave the smallest nod. Inside, her chest tightened. If she refused, she risked being seen as weak or ungrateful. If she went, she faced the stares, the whispers she had endured before. But something in Elias's tone steadied her. Not kind, not cruel, only matter of fact. She could endure that. The trail to town was short but exposed. The horizon stretched wide, and every hoofbeat carried them closer to where judgment waited. Elias rode steady, his eyes forward. He thought about how he was seen in that town, a man who kept to himself, who worked when asked, who never lingered in the saloon. He knew his name carried stories from years back, a man who had fought, who had killed, who had lost. Some feared him, some dismissed him, but none invited him in. He had accepted that long ago. When they reached the main street, boots scuffed on wooden sidewalks, voices dropped, and heads turned. A shopkeeper paused mid-count at his scales. A ranch hand leaned against the hitching post, his smirk sharp enough to be an insult without words. A woman in a stiff-collared dress whispered into another's ear, her eyes fixed on Taya's frame. Elias dismounted without hurry, tying the gelding. He looked back at Taya. "Stay close." She stepped down, keeping her chin level though her stomach nodded. Every whisper reminded her of what had been said before, that she was too big, unfit, a woman without use. She had believed, for a time, that such words might break her. Now she pressed them down and followed Elias inside the mercantile. The air in the shop smelled of grain and lamp oil. Shelves held flour sacks stacked in neat rows, tins of beans, jars of coffee. Elias set his list on the counter in his quiet way. 2 of flour, 1 beans, coffee, salt. His voice was steady, as if no one else in the room existed. The shopkeeper hesitated, eyes flicking to Taya, then back. He counted out the goods, slower than necessary, the coins clinking louder than usual, a deliberate show that he was in no rush for their kind. Taya felt heat climb her face but kept her gaze on the sacks, refusing to flinch. She wondered if Elias noticed the delay, if he would care. He gave no sign, only stacked the goods in a crate and lifted it with one arm. Before they left, a small voice called from behind a barrel. A boy, no older than 10, peeked out, his face curious, not cruel, his eyes fixed on Taya, and for once they did not hold scorn. He smiled, shy but open. Taya's lips curved before she could stop them, the first unguarded smile she had allowed in weeks. The boy's mother, startled, pulled him back by the shoulder, but her grip was not harsh. It was enough for Taya to carry that image out the door, a look not of pity, not of judgment, but of plain human curiosity. Outside, the stares still followed them, but Elias gave no attention to them. He secured the crate to the saddle, mounted, and offered his hand to Taya without hesitation. She took it, and together they rode out, leaving the weight of the street behind them. On the trail back, the silence between them felt different. Taya thought about the boy's smile, about how small a thing could cut through weeks of rejection. Elias, glancing at her once, noticed the shift in her face, the way her jaw was less tight, the way her shoulders were not braced for a blow. He said nothing, but inside, he acknowledged the truth. She had faced the eyes of the town and had not broken. By the time the cabin came into view, the wind had settled and the sun dropped low over the ridge. They unpacked the supplies, stowed them in their places, and sat at the table as the fire caught. They did not speak of what had happened in town, but each carried their own quiet understanding. For Elias, it was confirmation that she could endure the weight of other scorn. For Taya, it was proof that not everyone looked at her with hate. The day had not been easy, but it had held something new. The smallest crack in the wall the world had built around her. The days after their trip to town passed in quiet work. The supplies gave them some relief, but the land itself remained harsh. Wind shifted in odd patterns, carrying grit that scratched against the skin, and the sky carried a strange yellow cast that warned of more than heat. Elias had seen weather turn like this before, and he did not trust it. He checked the roof seams twice, made sure the well bucket was strong, and tied the gelding close to the corral post where he could reach it quickly. Taya noticed his unease, though he said little. She had lived long enough under the open sky to read signs in wind and light. Her chest tightened, and she asked one direct question at the table that evening. "Storm." Elias nodded once, cutting his bread. "Likely." His calm tone steadied her more than if he had spoken at length. When the storm arrived, it came sudden, as if the sky had split open without warning. The first gust slammed the cabin door against its frame, rattling the hinges. Dust filled the air outside, a thick red curtain that turned day to shadow. Elias pressed his weight against the door, bracing it shut, while Taya moved quickly through the room, tying the cupboard doors closed with rope and placing a pot under the place where the roof already leaked. The sound grew into a steady roar, boards creaking as though the cabin itself was under attack. The gelding screamed from the corral, a frantic sound that cut through the storm. Elias grabbed his coat, pulled it over his head, and forced the door open against the gale. Taya called after him, fear sharp in her voice for the first time since they had met. "Don't," but he was already outside. The wind struck him hard, stinging grit against his face, stealing his breath. He moved by memory, each step measured. At the corral, the horse fought the rope, eyes wide, flanks wet with sweat though no rain had fallen. Elias pressed his hand to its cheek, speaking low, steady words. His voice carried no fear, only command softened with patience. The horse shuddered, then stilled enough for him to retie the rope more securely and cover its eyes with part of his coat. Back inside, he dropped the coat heavy on the floor, his face streaked with dust and sweat. Taya's hands moved without thought. She pressed a damp cloth into his grip. He wiped his face and leaned against the wall, catching his breath. The storm hammered harder, and the door threatened to tear from its frame. Elias slid down to sit with his back pressed against it, his body weight keeping it steady. Taya sat close, near enough that she could hear the rhythm of his breathing over the howl of the wind. Her heart still raced from the moment he had vanished into the storm. She had known men who sought danger, who thrived on it. But Elias was different. He did what was necessary, no more. That steadiness unsettled her in a way she could not name. Hours dragged. The storm did not ease quickly. Boards moaned, dust sifted through cracks. The air grew dry enough to scrape the throat. They sat shoulder to shoulder, neither speaking, both listening for signs of collapse. In that silence, questions rose in Taya's mind. Why had he risked himself for the horse when he might have stayed safe inside? Why had he taken her in without demand? Why had he not asked about her past? The answers did not come, but the presence of his solid weight against the door was answer enough for now. When the storm finally broke, it left the land scoured clean and the air heavy with stillness. The sky opened to dull stars, and the cabin, though battered, stood firm. Elias stood slowly, stiff from holding the door. He checked the horse, the corral, the roof. Everything held. Taya followed him outside, her hair loose and dusted with grit, her eyes sharp in the faint light. Together they looked across the land, stripped bare of its soft edges. Back inside, Elias dropped another log on the fire. Taya set water to boil. They exchanged no words, but the silence carried something new. The storm had pressed hard on both of them, and neither had broken. In the small cabin, with the wind still whispering outside, the unspoken truth settled. They were no longer just two people thrown together by chance. They were a pair who had endured the same trial, and that changed everything. The storm left the land quieter than before, but silence never lasted long in the Arizona territory. Within days, Elias and Taya made their way back into town. The food from the last trip was holding, but nails, oil, and cloth were needed if the cabin was to keep standing through the season. Elias tied the gelding to the hitching post outside the mercantile, and already the eyes began to follow them. Inside, the shopkeeper's hands slowed again on the scales. A woman standing near the bolts of fabric whispered sharply into another's ear. Her words meant to sting, though she did not dare speak them aloud to Taya's face. A ranch hand close to the counter smirked, tilting his head toward her frame, and muttered something under his breath. Elias caught it clear. "Too big to bear children, ain't worth feeding." The words landed heavy. Taya's chest tightened as if the air had thinned. She kept her face steady, but her eyes lowered, her hands tightening on the fabric she had chosen. She had heard those words before, often enough to make her believe them at times. They were the reason her own people had stopped seeing her as useful, the reason settlers had left her behind. But hearing them now, spoken in a room, she entered beside Elias, dug deeper. She waited for him to flinch, to deny, or worse, to agree through silence. Elias set the goods on the counter with a flat hand. His voice, calm and low, carried across the room. 2 pounds of nails, kerosene, coffee, put it all on the scale. He never turned toward the ranch hand, never let the insult change his tone. But his eyes, steady and cold, rested on the man just long enough that the smirk faded. The shopkeeper busied himself with a tally. The room grew quieter. On the ride back, the silence was different. Taya held herself stiff, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Inside her chest, shame and anger twisted together. She wanted to ask Elias why he hadn't defended her outright, why he hadn't spoken against the lie. Yet she also knew what she had seen in his face, the refusal to give those men the satisfaction of rising to their bait. She wrestled with that, unsure whether to feel disappointed or steadied. When they reached the cabin, she busied herself with the wash basin, scrubbing her hands harder than needed. Elias watched for a moment, then set a tin cup of water by her elbow the same way he had on the first day. "They say a lot of things," he said, his voice carrying no judgment, only fact. Her hands stilled in the water. She wanted to believe him, but the words of others still echoed. She turned, her voice low but edged with the weight of years. "They say I am too big, that I cannot carry children, that I am nothing but wasted breath." Elias didn't look away. His face stayed lined but steady, his eyes fixed on hers. "They don't know you. They don't know what you've carried to still be here." The words landed in her chest with more force than she expected. No promises, no soft comfort, only recognition. For Taya, that meant more than defense spoken in town. She looked at him for a long moment, searching for the catch, the condition. There was none. He had spoken simply what he saw. They finished the evening together in silence. Taya dried the dishes while Elias stacked wood by the hearth. Outside, the land stretched endless and indifferent. Inside, the cabin held 2 people who had been marked by others as broken, yet neither had left. When the fire burned low, Taya folded her hands in her lap, her chest easing for the first time since the mercantile. She still carried the words spoken about her, but now they weighed less. Elias had not argued with the town, had not promised to shield her from it. Instead, he had given her something harder to dismiss, the sense that staying, despite what others believed, was its own kind of defiance. The days after the mercantile visit settled into a steady rhythm again, but both Elias and Taya knew the words spoken in town had not vanished. They would return, carried by men who needed someone else to scorn so they could ignore their own emptiness. Elias had lived long enough to know that silence, while strong, was often read as weakness by those looking for a fight. Taya, too, knew it. She had seen enough of how the world treated women left outside its narrow rules. Late one afternoon, the horizon filled with dust that did not belong to wind. Elias stood at the corral, mending a strap on the gelding, when he saw 3 riders approach. He said nothing but straightened, his hand resting lightly near his side. Taya, who was pulling clothes from the line, followed his gaze and felt her chest tighten. She had seen that look in men before, the slow ride-in, the slouch of shoulders meant to show power, the smirk that said they had already decided what she was worth. The first man called out before they even reached the porch. "Harper, heard you're keeping yourself company out here with a squaw too big to give you any young. Thought maybe you were renting her out for other work." His laugh was sharp, the kind meant to carry. The second rolled a match on his tongue, his eyes fixed on Taya as if measuring how far he could go before Elias moved. The third stayed quiet, but his gaze never left Elias, watching for weakness. Taya's body went rigid. Every insult she had endured before pressed down at once. But something had shifted since the storm and the words Elias had spoken days earlier. She no longer felt invisible. Her fear turned to a steady anger that held her upright. Elias stepped down from the porch, his boots firm on the dirt. He didn't raise his voice. "You've ridden far enough. Turn back." His tone was calm, but final. The first man smirked wider, spitting into the dust. "Didn't mean offense. Just thought if she's no use for bearing, maybe she's for sale in other ways." His words hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Before Elias could respond, Taya stepped forward. Her voice was clear, not loud but unshaking. "No more." She looked directly at the man, her hands still at her sides, her chin level. There was no plea in her tone, only fact. The man's smirk faltered. He had expected silence, shame, maybe tears. He had not expected defiance, spoken in steady words. Elias's eyes never left him, cold and unreadable. In that stare, the rider understood what would come next if he pressed even one step further. The second man shifted in his saddle, uneasy. The third muttered, "Let's ride." Their leader cursed under his breath, spat again, and turned his horse. They circled once, throwing a few more words over their shoulders, but they did not dismount. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, swallowed by the empty land. When the dust settled, Elias looked at Taya. For the first time since they had met, she met his eyes without lowering hers. The air between them carried something different now. Not just survival, but the knowledge that they had faced scorn and threat together and had not given ground. Elias walked to the door and pushed it open. He held it until she stepped inside beside him. No words passed between them. They didn't need them. The message had already been given. Neither of them would be moved by men who thought cruelty was strength. Inside, the cabin was still, the fire low. Taya's hands shook faintly as she folded the clothes she had pulled from the line, the fear leaving her body slowly. Elias set a hand to the table, steadying himself. He had fought men before, killed when it was needed, but this was different. This was not about blood. This was about making clear that what they had built here, however fragile, would not be taken apart by others' judgment. That night, when they sat down to eat, the air in the cabin felt changed. They had not only endured a storm of weather together, but now the storm of men's malice. Both had stood. Both had chosen not to leave. And for Elias, who had once sworn never to let another life into his, that realization came with a weight he could not ignore, a weight that no longer felt like burden, but like purpose. The air stayed uneasy after the riders left. Days stretched with work and silence. But both Elias and Taya knew men like that did not vanish from memory. Rumors in the territory traveled faster than wagons. And where Taya had been judged for what people believed she could not give, Elias had always carried whispers of another kind, that his past was written in blood. He had never spoken of it to her, but she had seen the way his jaw tightened when men lingered too long near their cabin, the way his hand rested near his belt even when no threat was visible. One afternoon, with the sun high and the soil dry underfoot, a rider appeared at the fence line. He was not dressed like the ranch hands or drifters who had come before. His hat bore the badge of a marshal. He rode steady, not rushing, but his presence carried the weight of authority. Elias stepped out from the corral, his body tense, his eyes unreadable. Taya, standing near the wash with a bucket, froze, her heart quickening. She wondered if this was the moment when the questions she had never asked about Elias would finally force their answers. The marshal swung down, dust rising around his boots. He greeted Elias by name, not asking, but stating, "Elias Harper." His voice was formal, practiced. "Brought word from Graham County. Matters closed. The record's written. No charges stand." Taya's grip on the bucket tightened. She looked to Elias, searching his face. He didn't move at first. His jaw locked, his shoulders stiffened. Only his hand, resting against the fence post, betrayed the tension running through him. The marshal went on. "Years back, you did what others wouldn't. Took down men who had left bodies behind them. Law didn't call it clean at the time. Some called it murder. Papers went quiet, but the trail didn't. This letter clears it. Says you walked away and stayed gone. That's all the law needed." He held out a folded sheet, its edges worn from the ride. Elias took it without a word. His eyes ran over the writing, though Taya could not see what it said. The marshal tipped his hat, glanced once at her, then back at Elias. You've kept to yourself. That's worth something. No more talk of the past. Not from us. With that, he mounted and rode off, leaving dust to swallow the sound of hooves. For a long moment, Elias stood unmoving, the letter folded in his hand. Taya wanted to ask, who had he killed? Why had the law chased him? But she saw the lines in his face, the way his eyes stayed fixed on a point far away, and she held her silence. She knew what it was to be judged by whispers. She would not add her own to his. Instead, she turned back to the cabin, set the bucket down, and reached for the knife to peel potatoes. Her motions were steady, exact, the scrape of steel against skin a grounding sound. After a while, Elias came inside, still holding the letter. He sat at the table, folded it again, and placed it beneath his palm. His voice was low, almost uncertain. I'm done running. Taya's hands stilled for a moment, then continued their work. She did not look up right away. I know, she said simply. It was not a question, not a demand for details, only recognition. The rest of the day, they worked side by side, planting late seeds in the small garden bed, staking canvas to shield them from the sun. Elias dug deep, his movements heavy but deliberate. Taya carried water, her arms steady despite the weight. The work spoke louder than words. That night, when they sat by the fire, Elias finally looked at her without the wall in his eyes. Lost my family. Years ago. Fever took them. After that, I carried violence with me. Didn't know how to stop, until it near swallowed me. He stopped there, not giving names or numbers, only the shape of the truth. Taya met his gaze. She did not recoil, did not question further. She only said, "You're here now." For Elias, that was more mercy than any court had ever given. And for Taya, who had carried her own brand of judgment, it was proof that the cabin they shared was no longer just a shelter. It was a place where neither had to explain why the world had turned its back. The night stretched quiet, the fire low. Outside, the desert wind moved through the brush. Inside, two people who had been marked as broken sat steady, no longer strangers bound by chance, but by a decision neither of them had spoken aloud: to remain. The weeks after the marshal's visit passed with a steadier rhythm. Elias and Taya spoke little of what had been said, but something had shifted. The past no longer loomed as a shadow between them. Yet both knew the world had ways of testing whatever peace they had managed to build. That test came not with another storm or with riders looking for trouble, but with the sound of hesitant footsteps at the fence line one hot afternoon. A boy no older than 10 stood there, his face streaked with dust, his shirt torn, and a bundle clutched tight under his arm. His forehead bore a shallow cut, not fresh but not cared for either. Taya noticed it first and stepped forward, her heart tightening with a mix of caution and concern. Elias followed her gaze and waited, silent, watching how the boy held himself. The boy spoke quickly, his voice thin but steady. "Ma's sick. Uncle says I gotta go live with cousin down by the river. He drinks. Shouts. I don't want to go. I can work. I can carry water, chop kindling. I won't talk much." His eyes darted between them, desperate but careful, as though one wrong word might send him running. Taya knelt, bringing herself to his height. She studied the cut, reached gently, and cleaned it with a cloth dipped in cool water. The boy flinched but did not pull away. Her hands were steady, her touch careful. Elias saw it, the way she gave what no one had given her, care without condition. Something in his chest shifted at the sight. They walked the boy back into town before making any decision. His mother lay in a small house near the edge, pale and weak, but her eyes clear. She explained between breaths that sickness had kept her from standing, and her brother wanted the boy off her hands until she recovered, or longer. She did not trust the cousin, but she had no strength to fight him. The preacher was called, and the uncle came too. There was no shouting, only tired negotiation. Elias kept his voice low and certain, laying out simple terms. The boy would stay at the cabin until the mother was strong again. He would work as he said he could, and if anything went wrong, the preacher would step in. The uncle, not cruel but careless, agreed with a shrug. The preacher wrote a short note to seal it. By sundown, the boys sat at Elias's table, chewing on bread while Taya ladled stew into bowls. The sound of 3 spoons instead of 2 filled the cabin. Elias watched the boy's eyes flick toward the walls, the hearth, the door, as if testing whether this place might hold him. Taya placed an extra blanket at the foot of the bed without fuss, then returned to the table. Later that night, when the boy had drifted to sleep on the bedroll by the fire, Elias and Taya sat in the quiet glow of the embers. Neither spoke at first, both listening to the even breathing of the child. It was a sound that had not filled this cabin in years for Elias, a sound he had thought he would never hear again. For Taya, it was proof that what others had said about her, that she could never give life, had been wrong in its cruelest way. She had given this boy safety, and in that there was life enough. Elias finally spoke, his voice low. "You think he'll stay?" Taya's eyes lingered on the boy, her expression unreadable but soft. "For as long as he needs." The truth of it settled between them. They had been judged as broken, unfit, too scarred to build anything lasting. Yet here was a child asleep under their roof, not because law or blood demanded it, but because they had chosen it. In that choice lay a new kind of family, one built not on what others expected, but on what they refused to give up, the act of staying. The boy's presence in the cabin changed the air in ways neither Elias nor Taya could have predicted. Morning sounds now included the scuff of small feet on the floorboards, the shuffle of him reaching for water before chores, and the occasional cough from sleep. Elias built a small trunk from spare pine boards for the boy's shirts, set hooks by the door for his coat, and added a second chair to the table with the same careful hands that had built the cabin years earlier. Taya cooked larger meals, teaching the boy how to rinse beans, cut potatoes without wasting them, and tend the fire. These were not grand changes, but the rhythm of 3 instead of 2 gave the cabin a settled weight that felt new and solid. The town at first muttered. Some questioned why Elias Harper, the man with a past and the woman marked by whispers, would take in a boy not their own. Others speculated about Taya, repeating the same words about her body and her supposed uselessness, though less boldly than before. But rumors did not feed cattle, patch roofs, or cure sickness. Slowly, talk turned back to survival, and eyes that had once lingered with scorn began to slide away in indifference. The shopkeeper no longer dragged his hands on the scale. The ranch hands who once smirked now nodded stiffly when Elias entered town. Judgment had not vanished, but it had lost its power to sting. One clear morning, Elias and Taya brought the boy to the preacher's steps. The mother, recovered enough to stand but still pale, had asked them to be part of what came next. Papers were signed, plain words confirming what had already become truth inside the cabin. That the boy would split his time, but his bedroll by the fire and his share of the table would remain his whenever he needed it. There would be no pulling him away to places that offered less than what he had found here. The preacher, seeing the way Elias stood beside Taya with the boy between them, spoke quietly of vows. Not the lofty kind, but simple promises about work, silence, and the act of staying. Elias and Taya spoke them without hesitation, words that fit their lives, to remain, to protect, to keep each other steady when the world pressed hard. Rings were not given, but the sign names on the paper held weight enough. The boy watched, chewing his lip, then smiled when Taya rested her hand lightly on his shoulder. The day ended with a meal outside the cabin. The boy's mother sat at the table, thin but grateful, and the preacher joined them as well. Bread was broken, beans passed, water poured. No one spoke of past crimes or failed expectations. The conversation was plain, grounded in small things. The garden starting to sprout, the horse needing a new shoe, the boy's cut healing clean. When evening dropped behind the ridge, Elias set a tin cup of water by Taya's hand without even thinking. She smiled, took it, and looked at him in a way that carried more certainty than words could. The boy leaned against the cabin door, full from supper, his eyes half closed, but his expression content. As the sky darkened, the cabin stood whole. There were no debts left unpaid, no questions left hanging. Elias Harper, once marked by violence and loss, had chosen not to run. Taya, once cast aside as unfit and unwanted, had found a place where her steadiness made her the center of a home. The boy, nearly lost to neglect, now carried the quiet assurance that he belonged. They sat together on the porch steps, the horse chewing in the corral, the garden rose just visible in the fading light. The land stretched vast and indifferent, but here at the edge of it, three people had chosen to remain, not because the world welcomed them, but because they had made their own. And in that choice, plain, steady, unbroken, they found love.